The home front of the United States in World War I saw a systematic mobilization of the entire population and the entire economy to produce the soldiers, food supplies, munitions, and money needed to win the war. Although the United States entered the war in April 1917, there had been very little planning or even recognition of the problems that the British or other allies had to solve on their home fronts. As a result, the level of confusion was high in the first 12 months. Then efficiency took control. The war came in the midst of the Progressive Era, which we just got done studying, when efficiency and expertise were highly valued. Therefore, the federal government and states as well set up a multitude of temporary agencies to bring together the expertise necessary to redirect the economy and society into the production of munitions and food necessary for the war, as well as the production of ideas necessary to motivate the people. Okay, so to start a war, or to even go to a war, you have to mobilize your economy or change it over so that you are now a wartime economy instead of a peacetime economy. Going to war was an enormously expensive undertaking. And then the first thing that President Wilson had to do was figure out how to pay for it. Well, to do that, he came up with the War Revenue Act of 1917. This increased federal reserves by 400% within 200 years. Well, how did they do that? They established high taxes and taxed the wealthiest Americans 77% of their annual income. So imagine having to give over 75% of your income to the United States in order to pay for people to go to war just because you were wealthy. The government borrowed tons of money. In addition to those taxes that people were paying, the government's going to borrow money from the everyday American. How are they going to borrow money? Well, they're going to borrow $20 million from Americans through Liberty bonds. So Americans are going to pay their money to the government for a bond, and the bond will gather interest over 10 years or 20 years or however long they bought it for. And then when they're done, the government's going to have to pay them back that money that they spent plus the income. So basically, it was just a loan from the American people to the federal government. Well, in those 2 years that we were in the war, 1917 through 1919, so a 2-year time period, we increased the debt from 1916, which was at $1.2 billion to $25.5 billion in 1919, just to fight for a little over a year and a half to 2 years in World War I. So, once we get going with the United States turning their economy to a wartime economy, we now have to start regulating industry. Well, what does that mean to us? It means that we're going to create the War Industries Board, and what they're going to do is they're going to regulate all the materials needed in the war effort. So they're going to regulate how much coal we need or how many munitions we need, and they're going to oversee the turnover of factories from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy. So the factory may change actually what it is making within the factory. It may have been making shoes or something else that was needed on an assembly line, and now it is going to make bombs or rifles or something else that is needed for the war effort. Once the military needs are met, and this would be regulated by the War Industry Board, they would know if this was met or not. Any remaining goods can be used by civilians. So, with these productions happening and the changeovers happening, the American industrial production is going to actually increase by 20%. So this is great for the American economy. Another way that the United States is going to get involved with the wartime economy is we're actually going to regulate food. So how much food people can actually buy at the grocery store and how much food we are going to send overseas to the troops. Not only are we feeding the American troops, but we're feeding the Allied troops of the British and the French as well. So we're not only supplying for ourselves, we're actually supplying for all the soldiers that are part of the Allies over in Europe fighting the war. The act that will help us with this is called the Lever Food and Fuel Control Act. This gives the government the power to set prices and establish production controls for food and fuels needed to run military machines. So now the government is stepping in and taking over how much prices and productions, or how much they're going to produce and how much they're going to sell it for, so that they can help the war effort. If you look To the right, I have started putting up propaganda posters because guess what? In class tomorrow, we are going to be making propaganda posters. So make sure you're checking those out as you go through this PowerPoint. This one is on feeding the soldiers, obviously, because that's what we're talking about. Also, the Food Administration will be created during this time. Their slogan throughout the war is, "Food can win the war." We're going to win the war by feeding the troops. They're going to increase the production of crops. They're going to conserve existing food supplies for military and the American allies. So everything that they're going to conserve here in the United States is actually going to go to the military and all the allies that we're fighting with to feed them. Farm production in the United States is going to soar. This is going to be a great thing for the farmers. They're going to start to make some money. And they're going to be able to increase all the production that they are doing. As we'll find out later on in the 1920s how that's going to change for the worse in the United States. But right now it is a great thing for the American soldiers in America. So how do they get the Americans on board for helping out the war effort? Well, the Food Administration is going to put out these propaganda posters, victory gardens. You're going to now start planting your vegetables at home. You're going to plant your own gardens and you're going to eat the food that you're growing instead of going to the grocery store and buying it. If you grow what you eat, then they can send that extra food overseas to the troops. So here are some Food Administration propaganda posters that you can look at while I'm talking and you're taking notes. Meatless Mondays was one of their slogans. So what does that mean? Well, you're not going to buy or eat meat on a Monday. That way they can take that extra food that you may have eaten or purchased that day, and they're going to send it over to the troops overseas. Wheatless Wednesdays. Well, same thing as the Meatless Mondays. You're not going to buy anything. You're not going to buy or eat bread on Wednesdays. That way the wheat that they would have either made into bread for you is now going to go overseas, whether they make it into bread or something else for the soldiers to use it for. They're also going to control alcohol content in beer and wine so that the crops to grow those can go towards the war effort. They're going to try and get Americans to not drink beer by linking German Americans to the brewing industry. Tensions were extremely high in the United States, and there was a lot of anti-German sentiment going on around the country. So the progressives, and we talked about the progressives, are going to hope that anti-German feelings would lead Americans to stop drinking beer. You hate the Germans, don't drink their beer. They made that. They're the enemy. Don't drink it, don't drink it. Don't buy anything from the enemy. Don't buy anything that may have come from the enemy. As the war progresses, the temperance movement or the anti-alcohol movement is going to gain strength. You guys have already talked about that. We know about the 18th Amendment. We're going to talk about that probably tomorrow night or in the near future. So they're doing things to try and get people at home to conserve, whether it's using the anti-German sentiments to get you to stop eating sauerkraut. And they're going to call it victory cabbage here in the United States. And you're going to eat victory cabbage instead of sauerkraut because sauerkraut is a German word and the Germans are our enemies. They're doing anything and everything that they can to help supply the war because Europe is in such devastation right now, they can't supply even their own troops. Like we just talked about, the 18th Amendment, you guys already know what this is. It's the banning the making, selling, or transportation of alcohol in the United States. People think that alcohol is bad. They think that it's ruining the home life. They think that it's hurting children and wives because husbands are coming home, or they're not coming home, they're taking their paychecks and they're going to the bars and they're drinking alcohol. So this is actually going to gain momentum during the war because if they can't make beer and wine because they need to send those goods to the troops, why do we even need to have it at all? So the 18th Amendment is going to pass. How are they going to enforce it? Because the 18th Amendment is something that can't be enforced. There's nothing behind it. The government's going to pass what is known as the Volstead Act. This gives the government authority to enforce the prohibition on alcohol. So this is going to give the police and other agencies in the United States to actually enforce the prohibition of alcohol. We also need to regulate fuel here in the United States. Well, you might ask, well, Ms. Stason, we haven't really talked about the production of cars or what they're using in order to run. Well, we may not be talking about gas. We're talking about coal and other fuels that heat the homes or turn on your lights. We need to regulate that because we need to be able to send that coal over to the troops so that they can use those to transport goods, troops, and other supplies that they need throughout the war front. they're going to create the Fuel Administration. The Fuel Administration is going to set production goals and prices for fuel, and then they're going to make sure that all the military needs were met. So everything that the military needs, they're going to make sure that they get them. In addition to these things, the Fuel Administration is actually going to introduce daylight savings time in order to extend daylight hours for those who worked long shifts in the factory. If they extend daylight, then they don't have to turn on the electricity in the factories for workers to work, so they can keep lights off longer and conserve that fuel that they need to send over to the troops. They also promoted throughout the war gasless Sundays, so not using gas to run cars or in the household, and heatless Mondays. Turn off your heat on Monday and we can use that fuel to send it over to the troops. So every agency that the government is putting together is actually trying to help the war effort and help get Americans involved in moving the war effort forward so that the Allies can win over the Germans. So after the government creates these boards and agencies to regulate food and fuel and other things that are all needed for the war in Europe, the government's able to quickly produce and collect supplies needed for the war effort. And we also become the major supplier for all the Allied troops because they aren't able to do it for themselves. So during the war, Great Britain received more than 1 billion rounds of ammo from the United States, 12 million rifles from the United States, and they also took more than a half a ton of explosives from the United States. So the American factories were a huge boost for not only the Allies, but for the American economy as well. So the United States is also going to be enriched by this. Okay, one last thing for you to do is run back to classjump.com, answer the following question. Tell me one way that the United States economy changed in order to help the war effort. This is a homework grade, so make sure you get it done before class tomorrow, and I will see you in class.